Hello, welcome to From Campus to Careers, the podcast where we help Aston students get ready for their future. Today's episode is part of a mini-series called The Workshop, where we offer practical tips and advice to help students secure a great placement and make sure they really shine when they're making their applications. Today's episode is going to be about AI. So if you're a student who's made a lot of applications and relied a lot on ChatGPT but not had much success so far, this is probably a great episode for you to listen to. Today, I'm with Josh Honey from the Placement Preparation team. He's a lead Placement Coordinator for the HLS and EPS colleges. So without further ado, let's get started with the show. Welcome, Josh. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. I mentioned in the introduction that you are a lead Placement Coordinator here at Aston. Before we get too much into the AI stuff, could you just tell me a little bit maybe about your role, what you do, and if you like about your career more generally?
Yeah, certainly. So I lead the kind of placement coordinations for students kind of going into their second year. So essentially, supporting students looking for placements, onboarding with some of their kind of career ideas, and kind of helping support some of that kind of destination conversation with regards to kind of placements, supporting things like CVs, cover letters, interview technique. We look at kind of working closely with the employers as well to kind of bring them closer, help them with kind of insight sessions, webinars, mainly within the health and life science, but also the engineering and physical sciences colleges. But I actually work across the whole kind of university, kind of in support of really kind of getting those students onto placement opportunities.
Lovely. And can you give me just a 101 about what you've done before you worked at the uni?
Yeah, so I've worked at other universities previously in the UK. Supporting students not only from a UK kind of placement side, but also international students. I've also worked internationally, so living in Southeast Asia, supporting students kind of onboarding into universities from Southeast Asia as well. So yeah, lots of things. I've worked as a nutritionist for a Premier League football team, which was really good insights. Part-time drummer.
I was going to say, don't
leave
out the drumming.
Full-time drummer, let's say, but so lots of different things.
Lovely.
Big variety.
Awesome, thank you. And before we talk about AI and kind of how it relates to your role and to our students, I thought it'd be interesting just to talk a bit about AI more generally, like for you. Mm-hmm. I don't know how AI is showing up in your world, what experience you have with it, or how it's impacting your friends and family, anything more general like that.
Yeah. I think for me, AI has been something that has been a kind of real passion, but certainly kind of curiosity as well. Certainly maybe in the last kind of 4 to 5 years. I think certainly with the advent of ChatGPT in the market, and maybe even some of the more kind of basic AI tools that people kind of take for granted these days. It's always been kind of one of those areas that I kind of like to explore, especially for work purposes. So really kind of using it as a kind of work tool. But yeah, so kind of in the last kind of maybe kind of 18 months, 2 years, a real kind of focus on how we can essentially use that within Aston University, how we can use it to support students. I think breaking down some of those walls as well, I think was one of my main kind of priorities. But yeah, so kind of in work life, that's kind of where my focus is. Certainly in personal life, use it for things like design. I don't go as far as using it to help me kind of figure out what I'm going to eat for dinner. I'm not that extreme, but certainly things like design, editing, lots of different kind of, I guess, smaller things that I will use it for, essentially kind of for stuff outside of, I guess, the work kind of environment.
Yeah, and I know from a previous conversation that you're helping out with like a working group for careers and placements?
Yeah. So in addition to kind of how I would use it ultimately in support of the team, but also in support of students and the kind of advice that we offer students, I work alongside other colleagues within careers and placements as part of an AI task force, essentially kind of exploring different types of AI, not just kind of looking at one type of LLM or different kind of program, essentially trying to explore how we can use it not only from a kind of staff perspective in support of students, but also how we can kind of use it with supporting students, but also students kind of getting a greater understanding of what's out there, what to use, maybe what not to use, and the kind of different scenarios that they should be using those kind of software within.
That's really interesting. I know I've seen quite a bit around the university about various programs and various bits of training for staff, and they're obviously keen to embrace AI and the efficiencies it can bring. But obviously it's interesting as well to think about how it relates to our students, and particularly for us, I suppose, the like application process, how students are or aren't using it, and how employers are. So I guess the main thing we wanted to talk about today was about like a guidance document that you've been developing. So can you tell me a bit about like why that document's come about and what you're hoping students might get from it before we talk about the content that's inside it?
Yeah, no problem. So essentially, I think through my role at Aston, I engage and have lots of conversations with students, whether it be in workshops or appointments or kind of one-to-one drop-ins, and really was getting a sense of a real kind of mixed I guess knowledge and background of kind of understanding about AI. So this was going from kind of students that were essentially kind of quite afraid to use it, and rightfully so in some cases, with some students then also on the other scale using it for lots of different things and lots of different applications, you know, for research, maybe for kind of helping with grammar work, even kind of doing all their work to a certain degree. But yeah, so a real kind of, I guess, kind of unbalanced kind of, I guess, understanding of essentially what Aston would want students to kind of use AI for, how to use it, essentially kind of I guess a kind of rough do's and don'ts to a certain degree. So I did really a kind of focused reach out to kind of get an understanding of essentially kind of what students were kind of, I guess, understanding about AI. And then from that, started researching what was out there, looking at kind of how students were effectively using AI in higher education. So looking at kind of other institutes, looking at kind of higher education, I guess, kind of support websites and organizations that the kind of university feeds into. And essentially bringing together a document that wasn't necessarily here to tell students, you know, don't do this, definitely do this, but more to kind of give a starter point to help students kind of get an understanding of kind of the expectations from Aston, looking at the idea of how we would ultimately expect students to use AI as a tool, the fact that it can be effective and that there can be kind of positive messaging from AI, as much as I know there's other kind of questions about AI that maybe aren't so positive. But yeah, really kind of a start point, which I think was the main focus for the first document anyway.
And you mentioned, I guess the document is not trying to give a fixed set of rules, or it's not preaching, but you said there's something in there about do's and don'ts. But I just wonder if you could tell us any more about what's in there, maybe just the headings or like what kind of other areas it covers.
And I think it's important, I guess, to kind of stress the idea that the document itself is fluid and it will always be changing, because as we've seen, you know, with AI, maybe in the last kind of 2, 3, 4 years, there's been a huge kind of change in the quality of different kind of AI software that's out there, but also what you can do with it, essentially, even from a kind of education perspective, but also from the idea of kind of what you can do with photos, media, coding, whatever it might be. It's really kind of ramping up. So I think it's there as a start point, but it will always be kind of reviewed in support of kind of what's coming. But really the document looks at the idea of kind of giving students a kind of start point. So we're looking at things like, you know, CVs, cover letters. You know, do we suggest, for example, using AI to create an entire CV from scratch that essentially doesn't really talk about the individual? Well, we know that speaking to employers, and certainly with careers and placements and the employer team that work closely with the employers that feed into Aston, that's a big no-no. But that doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, that students shouldn't use AI. And I think it's about, you know, using it as a tool, using it effectively to still have that human voice. And realistically, that's what the document is intended to kind of help students pursue, explore. And then, yeah, obviously with our team's kind of support and help, that we can kind of guide that across the year as well.
What kind of feedback or stories have you got from employers in terms of how they have experienced applications coming in?
Yeah. I think it's a mixed bag at the moment, and I think a lot of that is to do with the kind of employer market either being very proactive in certain areas where they've kind of embraced AI many years ago and they're fully aware of that, to the other side, which is employers essentially being reactive to applications coming in that are essentially just nothing but AI. So I've had, you know, great interactions with students and certainly employer kind of engagement where they've used AI to do kind of reviews, so virtual interaction reviews, maybe to help support students with some of the kind of question and answers that might come up to things like assessment centre days, and they've kind of really kind of used AI and lent an AI to kind of support those. in essence, more AI can therefore give you a wider kind of berth of students kind of going into those positions, so we can get more students kind of interviewing for roles. And I think it's a great experience, although, yes, I understand it's very daunting to kind of start using AI initially in that kind of context. But then likewise, the opposite of that is employers that are very kind of anti-AI. Maybe they're unsure, again, being kind of reactive to that wave of AI coming in. And so if they see a CV that essentially is written, maybe very well, maybe too well, there may be an element of bias that then rejects that CV. Now, we may have a student, and we've got excellent students that write, fantastic CVs pretty much from scratch, that I would, know for a fact that they're not AI. But employers potentially might look at them and think, is this actually, the true voice of the individual? And so it is a bit of a balance, and I think it's a bit of a mixed bag at the moment. So essentially then feeding back to that document, it's about how we can use it as a tool effectively, but not lose that human element of the CV cover letter or whatever it is that you're using it for.
Yeah, and I think a lot of some employers I've seen on websites have got a really clear policy, like this is how you should use AI. If you're applying to us, this is what's okay and this is what's not. But there are certainly many out there who are not sure themselves, right? Particularly smaller employers.
Yeah. I mean, I've had meetings with really kind of big employers. In fact, some of the kind of UK's big employers only kind of 18 months ago, kind of feeding into the kind of university, asking kind of what we would expect, and so kind of trying to almost kind of bounce ideas off Aston University about kind of what essentially students should be doing in these kind of applications. So it's very much a case of, I think, fact finding still. I think a lot of employers and there's certain markets that essentially are still kind of trying to catch up in certain ways. But yeah, I think it's a case of really for students, the message is about kind of how you can use AI, how you can still be real in a world that essentially can sometimes see kind of unreal, especially when you've got such high saturation of AI applications going through. It makes it very difficult for that individual human to kind of be heard and seen. And so I think a lot of the kind of initial guidance that we're putting out there is how to kind of navigate those first stages. But, as I always say to students, reach out to us. If you're unsure, it's a case of just reaching out to our team. We can kind of help and continue that guidance, potentially from that initial kind of engagement with the document.
That's really good. Thank you. We've talked a bit about kind of, I guess, some of the issues that students might face and employers might face. Do you have anything to add in terms of like what students are saying to you? Like they're confident or they're not, or they're worried, or they don't want to talk about it with you, or what are you finding?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a real, kind of wide, I guess, kind of spectrum of students that essentially are going to be, quite fearful about using AI. And I think a lot of it is because of, fear of things like, turn it in and the kind of, the academic side of things. There is a huge amount of conversations that I've had with students where essentially they're kind of unsure about what they use it for. They might use it for, creating a new image, or to kind of, see, what are the top 10 kind of places to go on holiday. But anything with regards to kind of the prompt and the kind of using prompts effectively to support maybe kind of academic work or certainly applications in this context, they're just unsure about. And then we get the kind of complete other end of the spectrum where you've got students that are effectively using it for everything and anything. They're using it from a kind of automated perspective. I've had one student this year that definitely raised their hands and said that they take photos of their fridge using ChatGPT 5, and then it basically will then figure out a recipe for what they can cook on that day. So there are quite large extremes, and I think that's okay. I think that's quite a natural thing to have those kind of different kind of experiences. Ultimately, for me, it's always about kind of where we can really kind of kickstart that kind of engagement with AI. And I think it's important to kind of stress that not every student has to engage with AI.
Yeah.
It's not a necessity, but I think it's one of those things that, from a perspective of how employers are using AI, certainly, it's important to kind of be aware of it.
Yeah.
Because even though you may choose not to use AI, you might write your CV and cover letters from scratch, and that's absolutely fine. It's certainly what I did. It's a case of thinking about actually how is the employer market using AI, and how are they kind of going to be integrating that in potentially kind of assessment centres and the application process.
It sounds like the risk is there's a lot of students scared to use it, as you say, because will my AI use be picked up? Will that cause problems for me? And then there's maybe some students using it too much, and it's almost about trying to get most people to a happy medium.
It's a balance, yeah. It's a balance, I think, which is important. I think it's understanding how to use it, where and when. Do you use it differently at home, in your own personal life? I talk to students that are using it for editing. They might use kind of the Adobe side of things that I know Aston obviously is a huge kind of part of. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I think when it comes to things like CVs, cover letters, there's different ways. And I think there's kind of more kind of a subtle approach. And kind of understanding the kind of prompts that can support that. Even going down to things like how to search for placements and kind of different kind of career opportunities. It can be really effective. But again, I think it's understanding those kind of prompts, and I think that's where a lot of the students that I talk to maybe struggle with. And so certainly kind of moving forward, I know that myself and the kind of AI team that work within the careers and placement side will be looking at kind of the idea of kind of prompt management and that kind of, how to kind of effectively support prompts with AI as it advances and moves forward. So
yeah, wonderful. You kind of moved a little bit into my next question, which is about any tips. If you had to pick, I don't know, 2 or 3 maybe.
Yeah.
Key tips, either that live in the document or that you would just like to share with students, what would they be?
So many. I think the one that I always kind of point students to, especially at this time of year, but I think really it can be used at any time of year when looking for roles, placements or kind of future careers. Going through Aston Futures, sometimes there can be hundreds of roles that, you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, that's what I want to go for. That's kind of the sector, that's my area. But I'm fundamentally aware as well that we have students that, are studying, they've got module deadlines, exams, lots of our students kind of work part-time, full-time and have other kind of commitments outside the university. So for me to turn around to a student in an appointment and say, could you, after this appointment, go home and read 100 job descriptions? Sometimes that's a little bit, it's probably not going to happen, to be honest. So actually taking a job description and putting it into Copilot. So you can actually put that into Copilot and literally have a prompt that would be written something like, can you identify the key skills within this job description? And you can use that over and over and over again, that same prompt. And then just copy and paste that particular job description. What that will then do is basically strip all the noise, all the kind of words and jargon. And if you're just looking for those key skills, essentially the things that we would always recommend that you align your CV to, that's a great start because it kind of cleans everything up. Yeah. You get a nice bullet pointed list, no nonsense, straight to the point. And it's a good way, it's a good tool of then kind of using it to be a little bit more precise, a little bit more effective and kind of the kind of time management as well.
Yeah, and I know one of the things I had heard an employer talk about is, getting 50 applications that look exactly the same. What would a student do once they've got that list of key skills, maybe provided by Copilot, for example? What would they do then to make sure their application still stands out?
I think it's about, again, going back to that balance, it's about you have to have your own kind of authentic voice. And I think it's a case of really looking at how we can then incorporate those skills into, student experience. And again, going back to that kind of varied conversation that I have with students. I talk to students that have got lots of experience, some students that have got no experience at all. So it's kind of thinking about where you can pull these skills from. So, an example would be if you've got a job description, it's saying about communication. Could you essentially pull that from maybe some of the kind of project work you've done within your academic studies? Every student at Aston does a project of some sort. So yeah, that's a great way of highlighting that. But again, it's going back to kind of making sure you've got that authentic voice. So although, yes, in this instance, Copilot can help you identify those skills, it's very much a case of using, your own approach. Our team definitely kind of recommend using the STAR technique to kind of help build and kind of structure. And again, Copilot's great to help kind of that next stage of kind of identifying your own experience, your skills, whether it be work-based, voluntary, academic, and then putting that into some kind of STAR-based kind of setting. But again, it still has to have that voice. And so really making sure that you're taking the time to kind of identify your own kind of career journey, your own path, and making sure that kind of, reads well within the CV.
Lovely, thank you. You mentioned Copilot a couple of times. Is there a reason why you would go towards Copilot rather than other AI software? Or?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of AI software out there, and talking to students, I've met a couple of students this year that have got AI essentially built into their laptops. So it's one of those things where at a push of the button, essentially the laptop becomes kind of AI ready. The reason that we would recommend to use Copilot for Aston students specifically is the fact that through your student kind of account or your student access, Copilot is actually protected under kind of Aston's kind of data protection as such. So lots of students that I talk to kind of, especially if they're looking at kind of building a new CV or maybe a more kind of professional or sector relevant CV, for example, they'll drop their CV into, ChatGPT or Gemini and maybe ask for a review, maybe ask for kind of, ChatGPT to shape it towards a sector. The issue with that is essentially we don't really know where that data goes or to the extent of how much your own personal data is going out into the world. And I know that for a lot of the students at Aston, that's a real kind of cause for concern, especially with AI and the kind of the amount of AI that's used now across the world to kind of impact different things and kind of measure different things essentially. So with Copilot, essentially you can do that. You can drop that into Copilot, again, signing in with your student access, and that is protected by Aston. So it's a bit more kind of security, a little bit more kind of, making sure that students kind of, are kind of safe in that environment.
I've heard data is a big issue for students, and I've also heard some students talk about environmental concerns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not your place necessarily to have an opinion, but do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, I think it is a concern. I think it's something that we should all be aware of. So you won't find me saying, asking ChatGPT, for example, what I'm going to wear if it's raining, because I could probably figure that out myself. And I think that the impact on the world is probably, a little bit more important than me asking that question. I think it's about kind of the sensible use. It's about that balance again. It's about thinking about kind of how we can use these tools. And again, going back to that idea of choice, you don't have to use AI if you don't want to. I think essentially the message that we're kind of trying to get across certainly today, but also with the document, is looking at the idea of making sure that you're aware, because it's obviously being used not just by students, but also by employers. So I think when we look at the kind of ethical side of things, I think it's a good point to raise. Really good kind of topic to raise. And again, our team are kind of quite open to those conversations as and when. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I guess just to move us towards the finish, where can students find the document, and what other support is available for students if they want to talk about AI or if they just want support generally with their search? Yeah.
So the documents are available on the Careers and Placement website. And you'll be able to find that in the resources page. Again, if you're unaware how to navigate that, it's really, really easy. But again, you can always reach out to the placements team or the kind of careers team as such, and we can kind of obviously navigate accordingly. And then really looking at kind of the idea of kind of support. I think if it's kind of looking at, being unsure about what AI to use, maybe navigating Copilot, again, reach out to the team. So contact either the placements team if it's placements that you're looking for, or vice versa, the careers team, and they can navigate accordingly. And then for support wise, really, it's a case of, for me, it's all about having conversations. So whether it be about kind of how to use AI, or maybe even kind of looking at the idea of how to kind of incorporate that as a tool within kind of the kind of careers and placements kind of, pathway. It's about conversation. So I would always recommend students to book in with us, even if they have one appointment. Just book in, have a conversation. We can sit down. I'm always kind of open to kind of talk about kind of how to use Copilot and navigate it, and how it can be an effective tool for students. So so just reach out, have an appointment, and book via Aston Futures.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think that's all we have for today. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate you joining us. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of From Campus to Careers. If you enjoyed the episode, follow us on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcast. And remember, you can book an appointment with the Careers and Placement team by going to Aston Futures.